The marriage contract felt thin as a moth's wing in Silas Blackwood's coat pocket, yet it was the only thing holding his world together. It was the document that proved to the Territorial Land Office that he, a bachelor homesteader, was fulfilling the final condition of his claim, to build a family, to put down roots in the unforgiving soil of Wyoming. Without a wife's signature on the affidavit by the 1st of April, his 160 acres, his drafty dugout cabin, and the creek that was his only real asset would revert to the government, which meant it would be snapped up by Bartholomew Thorne before the ink was dry. Therefore, he stood before the clerk's office in Bitter Creek, stamping his feet against a cold that felt personal. The winter of 1882 had been brutal, a relentless siege of snow and wind that had left the world bleached and silent. The noon stage from Cheyenne was late, its delay marked by the growing knot in Silas's stomach. He had spent his last dollars on the agency fee and the woman's passage. He had corresponded for 6 months with a Miss Sarah Jones of Ohio, whose letters spoke of church socials and a desire for a quiet life. He pictured a woman like the paper she wrote on, pale, gentle, and easily creased. When the heavy coach finally lumbered into view, pulled by 4 weary horses steaming in the frigid air, Silas felt a tremor of hope. The driver swung down, his face a mask of frosted whiskers, and opened the door. The town's few idle eyes turned to watch. A boot appeared first. It was not the delicate, buttoned shoe of a woman from Ohio. It was a man's riding boot, scuffed and practical, followed by another just like it. Then the figure emerged, and a ripple of quiet shock moved through the onlookers. It was a woman, but not the woman Silas had imagined. She was dressed entirely in black, dungarees, a tailored wool shirt, and a long duster that fell to her ankles. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that was clearly not from Ohio. She was Chinese, her features sharp and intelligent, her gaze sweeping over the town with a cool, assessing calm. On her hip, tied low and sitting with familiar ease, was a Colt revolver in a worn leather holster. She moved with a fluid grace that was almost unnerving, her eye scanning the small crowd before they landed on Silas. He must have been easy to spot, the only man standing there looking as if he'd been struck by lightning. She walked directly toward him, her steps measured and silent on the hard-packed snow. The townsfolk parted for her as if she were a storm cloud. She stopped a foot from him. Up close, he could see the dusting of trail grime on her high cheekbones and the utter lack of fear in her dark, almond-shaped eyes. She looked him up and down, a quick, dismissive appraisal that took in his mended coat and his worn-out boots. Silas felt himself shrink under her gaze. "You are Blackwood." Her voice was low and clear, with an accent he couldn't place. It held no deference, only a demand for information. He could only nod, his throat suddenly tight. Without another word, she reached into the inner pocket of her duster and produced a sealed envelope. She pressed it into his hand. Her fingers were cold but her grip was firm. "From the Matrimonial Correspondence Agency," she said, as if that explained the gun, the clothes, and her very existence on this frozen street. Silas stared at the envelope. It was his only hope, but the woman who delivered it felt like a premonition of doom. He did not yet know that the letter in his hand was less of an explanation and more of a cage, and she was the one holding the key. His fingers were numb with cold as he broke the wax seal. The letter was from Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor of the agency in Cheyenne. The script was tidy, but the words felt hurried. "Mr. Blackwood, regret to inform you of a last-minute complication. Miss Sarah Jones has taken gravely ill with lung fever and is unable to travel. However, so as not to see you forfeit your claim, we have arranged a suitable replacement. The young woman who bears this letter, Miss Lynn, is Miss Jones's distant ward. She is of strong character and sound health. The contractual obligations remain the same. The dowry, as agreed upon, has been entrusted to her. Please find enclosed the amended contract. Your signature is all that is required. Yours in service, F. Abernathy." Silas read it twice. Distant ward. Strong character. These were words used to smooth over a disaster. He looked up from the page at the woman who called herself Lynn. She hadn't moved. Her expression was unreadable, her posture a challenge. She was watching him, waiting for his decision. The whole town was watching. He could feel Bartholomew Thorne's eyes on him from the doorway of the land office across the street. Thorne was a patient vulture, and Silas was the dying cattle. To refuse was to lose everything. The acres he had cleared by hand, the dugout he had dug into the hillside, the future he had staked on this single piece of paper. To accept was to invite this gunslinger, this complete and utter mystery, into his life, onto his land. He was a farmer, not a fighter. He knew about soil and seasons, not about women who wore guns as if they were jewelry. The cold was biting deep now, a physical ache in his bones. He looked at Lynn's face, searching for something, anything to guide him. He found nothing but a profound and unnerving stillness. She was a locked door. But behind him was a cliff's edge. "All right," he said, the word a puff of white in the air. He walked on stiff legs into the clerk's office, the woman following a pace behind him. He signed the amended contract with a trembling hand, the clerk looking from him to Lynn with wide, disbelieving eyes. When the document was stamped and filed, Silas Blackwood was legally married to a stranger who carried a gun and a secret. He had saved his land, but he had a sinking feeling he had just lost something far more important, his peace. The wagon ride back to his homestead was silent. The rhythmic squeak of the wheels on the frozen ruts was the only sound between them. Lynn sat beside him on the buckboard, her duster pulled tight, her hat still low over her eyes. She stared straight ahead at the bleak, snow-covered landscape, seemingly unimpressed by the vast, empty beauty of it. Silas, for his part, was acutely aware of her presence. She was smaller than he'd first thought, but there was a coiled tension in the way she sat, a readiness that made the air around her hum. His claim was 5 miles out of town, a solitary patch of earth carved out of the wilderness. When they crested the last rise and his dugout came into view, a wave of shame washed over him. It wasn't much more than a hole in the side of a hill, with a sod roof and a single stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke. A small, sturdy barn stood nearby, sheltering his mule and 2 milk goats. It was a poor man's life, laid bare. He expected a comment, perhaps a look of disgust. He got nothing. Lynn simply took in the scene with that same unnerving calm. When he pulled the wagon to a halt, she swung down before he could offer a hand. She retrieved a single, heavy-looking saddlebag from the back and walked toward the cabin. "The mule needs tending," Silas said, his voice sounding rough in the quiet. "And the goats?" "I know what a farm requires," she replied without turning around. Her tone wasn't sharp, merely factual. Inside, the dugout was one room, cramped and dark, but clean. A small stove radiated a meager warmth. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a cot in one corner, and shelves holding his few provisions made up the entirety of his worldly possessions. It was a lonely space, and her presence in it felt like a profound intrusion. She placed her saddlebag on the floor and took off her hat, revealing a cascade of straight, black hair tied back with a simple leather thong. She looked around the small room, her eyes lingering for a moment on the single cot. A new, more complicated tension entered the space. "The loft in the barn is dry," Silas said quickly, his face growing hot. "There's hay. I can make you a place." "No," she said, her voice firm. "The contract is for a wife. A wife lives in the house. You will sleep in the barn." Silas stared at her, speechless. He had expected to be the master of his own home, however humble. But the woman standing before him was not a meek bride from Ohio. She was giving orders. He opened his mouth to argue, to assert his position, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't malice, it was a simple, unbreakable statement of terms. He was the one who had been desperate enough to sign the paper. She was merely enforcing the contract. Defeated, he nodded. He gathered his spare blanket and a few belongings and left her there, in the center of his home. As he walked toward the barn, the cold Wyoming wind felt like a fitting companion. He had a wife, and he had his land. But he was now an exile in his own life. The next few days passed in a strained, silent routine. Silas would wake in the cold barn, tend to the animals, and find a plate of food left for him on the cabin's porch step. It was usually just beans and hardtack, but it was always there. He worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences and chopping wood for the insatiable stove, driven by a restless energy. He was too proud to ask for more, and she did not offer it. They were two strangers orbiting each other, their paths crossing only at a distance. He would see her sometimes, standing in the doorway, watching the horizon. She never seemed to feel the cold. The town had not forgotten them. The gossip must have been running rampant. He dreaded the necessary trip for supplies, but the flour sack was nearly empty. He put it off for as long as he could, but a week after her arrival, he had no choice. As he hitched the mule to the wagon, Lynn emerged from the cabin. She was wearing her duster and hat, the Colt settled on her hip. "I am coming with you," she stated. It was not a request. "There's no need," Silas said. "I can manage. Thorne's men will be in town," she said. "They will see you alone. They will think you are weak." Her perception startled him. She was right. A trip to town alone would be seen as a sign that his strange new wife was a prisoner, or that he had already lost control. It would be an invitation for trouble. With a sigh, he gestured for her to climb aboard. Bitter Creek was busier than it had been the week before. As they pulled up to the general store, Silas could feel the stares. Windows suddenly had faces in them. Conversations on the boardwalk dropped to whispers. He tried to ignore it, focusing on his list of supplies. As he was negotiating with the storekeeper, the door creaked open and a shadow fell across the room. Bartholomew Thorne stepped inside, flanked by two of his hired hands, big men with mean, stupid faces. Thorne was the opposite of his men. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored city suit, a stark contrast to the rough-spun clothes of everyone else. He was handsome, with a politician's smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Blackwood," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Good to see you out and about. I trust you're settling into your new, domestic arrangement." His eyes flickered toward Lynn, who was standing by the counter, examining a sack of seeds with feigned interest. The insult was clear. "We're fine, Thorne," Silas said, his jaw tight. Thorne chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Are you? Your claim is a harsh place for a delicate flower. Especially one from so far away." He took a step toward Lynn. "Tell me, my dear, is this man treating you well? The law takes a dim view of mistreating a wife, even a temporary 1-inch. Silas saw a flash of something in Lynn's eyes, a dangerous spark. Before she could react, he stepped between them. "She's my wife, Thorne. That's my business. This is a general store. If you're not buying, you should leave." The words were bolder than anything he'd ever said to the man. Thorne's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His men tensed. The storekeeper looked like he wanted to crawl under the counter. Thorne recovered quickly, his smile returning, but it was thinner now, sharper. "Of course. Just a neighborly inquiry." He tipped his hat. "Enjoy your day." He and his men left, but the threat lingered in the air like cigar smoke. Silas paid for his goods, his hands shaking slightly. He had stood up to Thorne, a small victory, but he knew it was only the beginning. As they loaded the supplies into the wagon, he noticed Lynn looking at him with a new expression. It wasn't approval, not exactly. It was more like she was re-evaluating an equation and had found an unexpected variable. The confrontation in town had changed something. The silence on the ride home felt different, less hostile. But Silas knew Thorne would not let the matter rest. A man like that saw any defiance as a challenge to be crushed. What he found in the barn that night would prove just how far Thorne was willing to go. He was bedding down the mule when he noticed it. One of the stall doors in the back, where he stored his seed for the spring planting, was slightly ajar. He knew he had locked it. A cold dread washed over him as he grabbed his lantern and went to investigate. The lock had been broken, the heavy iron clasp twisted and snapped. Inside, his seed sacks had been slashed open, the precious content spilled and mixed with mud and animal filth on the floor. It was a year's hope, a season's work, ruined. Rage, cold and pure, surged through him. This was Thorn's work. It was a message. It wasn't just about the land anymore, it was about breaking him, grinding him into the dirt until he gave up and crawled away. He stumbled back out into the barn, the lantern light dancing on his ruined future. He slid down against the wall, the full weight of his despair crashing down on him. It was over. He was beaten. The main barn door creaked open. Lynn stood silhouetted against the fading twilight. She held a rifle in her hands, holding it loosely but with an expert's familiarity. She looked at the ruined seed, then at Silas. Her face, for the first time, showed a flicker of something other than cool detachment. "He will not stop," she said softly. "I have nothing left to fight him with," Silas whispered, his voice cracking. This was everything. She walked over and looked down at the mess. "This was your future," she corrected him. He did not take the land. Not yet. She looked back at him, her eyes dark and serious in the lantern light. "You have one thing left to fight with." "What?" he asked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "A broken farmer." "Me," she said simply. The word hung in the cold air between them. It was not a promise of victory or an offer of comfort. It was a statement of fact, as practical and as solid as the gun she held. He looked up at her, at this strange, dangerous woman who had upended his life, and for the first time, he didn't feel fear. He felt a tiny, fragile spark of something else. He did not yet know that her fight was far older and more dangerous than his own, and that by accepting her help, he was stepping into a war he couldn't possibly imagine. That night, for the first time, she did not send him to the barn. She gestured to the floor by the stove. "Sleep here." An enemy does not divide his forces. It was a tactical decision, not an invitation, but Silas accepted it. He lay on his blanket, listening to the wind howl outside and the quiet sound of her breathing from the cot. The warmth of the stove was a small comfort against the chilling certainty that Thorn's attack on his seed was just the first move in a much deadlier game. A few weeks later, the real attack came. It wasn't with fists or knives, but with the law. The territorial marshal, a portly man named Calloway with a drooping mustache and Thorn's money lining his pockets, rode up to the homestead with 2 deputies. Silas and Lynn met them in the yard. "Silas Blackwood?" Calloway asked, though he knew perfectly well who Silas was. He unfolded a piece of paper. "I have a warrant here. It's a complaint filed by Mr. Thorn. Says your property line is improperly marked. Claims your creek access actually belongs to his southern pasture, according to the original territorial survey." "That's a lie," Silas said, his heart sinking. "The survey markers are clear. I put them in myself, with the land agent." "Well, Mr. Thorn has his own survey map, signed and sealed," Calloway said, enjoying himself. "Says you're trespassing. The judge will have to sort it out. Until then, this warrant gives me the authority to fence off the disputed area. Thorn's men will be here this afternoon to put up the wire." To lose the creek was to lose the farm. Without water, the land was worthless. This was Thorn's checkmate. Silas felt the familiar wave of helpless fury. He was being robbed in broad daylight, with the law itself holding the gun. "You can't do this," he said, his voice pleading. "It's already done," Calloway said with a smug smile. He turned to Lynn. "And I have another matter." A telegraph came down from San Francisco. "There's a warrant out for a Chinese woman, an outlaw named the Shadow, wanted for robbing a railroad payroll. The description fits you. I'm going to have to ask you to ride into town with me for questioning." The world seemed to stop. Silas looked at Lynn. Her face was a perfect, still mask, but he saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand drifted almost imperceptibly toward the gun on her hip. The payroll story was a lie, he was sure of it, a fabrication to get her out of the way. If she went with Calloway, she would disappear into a cell, and he would never see her again. This was the moment. The choice he had been avoiding. He could let them take her. He could plead ignorance. He could save himself and his worthless, waterless patch of dirt. He thought of her standing over his ruined seed, her quiet declaration, me. He thought of the food on the porch step, the silent companionship, the way she had faced down Thorn in the store. She was a stranger, a mystery, but she was the only person who had stood with him. He took a step forward, placing himself slightly in front of her. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but his voice came out steady. Her name is Mrs. Blackwood, he said, looking Marshal Calloway directly in the eye. She is my wife. She's been on this claim with me for over a month. She hasn't been anywhere near a railroad, let alone a payroll. Your warrant is a mistake. Calloway's eyes narrowed. Are you obstructing a federal marshal, son? I'm stating a fact, Silas said. My wife is here, under the protection of my home. You are not taking her anywhere without a warrant with her proper, legal name on it. And as for my creek, he took a deep breath, your warrant is based on a fraudulent map. You and I both know it. If Thorn's men set one foot on my property to string a single wire, I will consider it a hostile act. And I will defend my home. The deputies shifted, their hands moving to their guns. Calloway stared at Silas, a new respect dawning in his dismissive eyes. This was not the timid farmer he knew. Lynn moved then. It was a subtle, fluid motion. She stepped up beside Silas, her hand now resting on the butt of her Colt. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her presence at his side was a statement more powerful than any threat. The two of them, the broken farmer and the outlaw woman, stood together against the law, against the money, against the whole weight of Thorn's power. Calloway held their gaze for a long moment. He was a bully, not a fool. He knew what a shootout with a woman known to be a gunslinger would mean, especially over a flimsy warrant. He wasn't paid enough by Thorn to die for it. This ain't over, Blackwood, he snarled, but the threat had lost its teeth. He wheeled his horse around. Let's go, he barked at his deputies. They rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a tense, ringing silence. Silas stood frozen, the adrenaline slowly draining out of him, leaving him weak and trembling. He had done it. He had faced them down. He turned to Lynn. Her hand was still on her gun. She was watching the retreating riders, her eyes narrowed. Thank you, he said, his voice hoarse. She finally looked at him. The mask was gone. In her eyes, he saw a turmoil of emotions he couldn't name. You are a fool, she said, but there was no heat in it. You should have let them take me. They would have taken the land next, he replied. You said it yourself. An enemy does not divide his forces. A small, sad smile touched her lips for the very first time. No. I suppose he does not. That night, she told him everything. They sat at the small table, the lamp casting long shadows on the walls of the dugout. Her name was not Lynn. It was Way. She wasn't a common outlaw. Her family had been merchants in San Francisco until they were ruined by a criminal syndicate that Thorn was a part of. The syndicate trafficked in everything, from smuggled goods to people. Her brother had tried to expose them and had been killed for it. Way had been fighting them ever since, a ghost in their system, freeing their victims and disrupting their operations. The real Sarah Jones had been one of those victims, an indentured girl being sold through the marriage agency to a husband who was one of Thorn's lieutenants. Way had intercepted her, given her money, and sent her east to a new life. She took her place not just to hide, but to strike at the heart of Thorn's Wyoming operation. The dowry was syndicate money she had managed to steal. The wanted poster was a fiction created by Thorn's corrupt law enforcement contacts to hunt her down. She reached into her saddle bag and pulled out a small object wrapped in silk. She unwrapped it carefully. It was a small, intricately carved jade token of a dragon. It was my brother's, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It is all I have left of my family. Silas looked at the token, then at her face. He saw not a gunslinger or an outlaw, but a woman who had lost everything and was still fighting. He finally understood the steel in her spine, the sadness in her eyes. Her war was so much bigger than his struggle for 160 acres. Why tell me now? He asked. Because today, she said, meeting his gaze, you did not fight for your land. You fought for me. Now my fight is yours, whether you want it or not. Thorn will not send the law next time. He will send killers. 3 months passed. The Wyoming winter finally broke its grip, giving way to a hesitant spring. The snow receded, revealing the muddy, sleeping earth. The threat of Thorn's killers had never materialized. Silas had taken a great gamble. He had used what little money they had to send a long, detailed telegraph to a territorial judge in Cheyenne, a man known for his integrity. He laid out the whole story: Thorn's land grabbing, the fraudulent survey, Marshal Calloway's complicity, and the suspicious warrant for his wife. He didn't know if it would work, if a judge would listen to a poor homesteader over a rich landowner. It was a shot in the dark. During those months of waiting, the dugout cabin changed. Silas and Way worked side by side from dawn until dusk. They cleared new ground, turning the dark soil for a spring planting. They reinforced the barn and built a new, stronger corral. He taught her about the seasons, about the feel of the soil, about which clouds brought rain and which brought wind. She, in turn, taught him to be quiet, to watch, to see the world not just for what it was, but for what it could be. The silence between them was no longer strained. It was a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the easy rhythm of shared work. He learned the sound of her footsteps, and she learned that he always left the last cup of coffee for her. He slept on the floor by the stove, but the distance between his blanket and her cot no longer felt like a chasm. It was a space of mutual respect. He never called her Lynn again. She was Way. One afternoon in early May, a rider approached the homestead. It wasn't the marshal or Thorn's men. It was a courier from the telegraph office in town. He handed Silas a thick envelope. Silas's hands trembled as he opened it. It was from the office of Judge Micah Abram. He read the letter aloud, Way standing beside him. The judge had launched a federal inquiry. Investigators sent from Cheyenne had found widespread evidence of Thorn's schemes, fraudulent deeds, bribed officials, intimidation of homesteaders across the territory. Marshal Calloway had been removed from his post and was facing charges. A federal warrant had been issued for the arrest of Bartholomew Thorn. The warrant for the Shadow had been exposed as a fabrication and was officially voided. His claim was safe. The creek was his. Way was free. Silas let the letter drop to the table. He looked at Way, a slow smile spreading across his face. A weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying lifted from his shoulders. She was smiling too, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed her face. In that moment, she was not a fighter. She was just a woman, standing in the home she had helped to build, finally safe. That evening, as the sun set, casting a golden light across the newly plowed fields, Silas found himself looking at the amended marriage contract, which still lay on a shelf. It was just a piece of paper, a legal fiction that had brought them together. He picked it up, the ink faded, the creases worn deep. Way came and stood beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. She saw what he was looking at. She reached into her pocket and took out the small jade dragon, placing it on the table next to the contract. The worn paper and the ancient stone, one representing a desperate lie, the other a painful truth. He looked from the objects to her face. He saw his future, not in the lines on a map or the words on a contract, but in the quiet strength in her eyes. He had sent for a wife to save his land, but fate had sent him a partner who had helped him save himself. He reached out, his calloused farmer's hand covering hers where it rested on the table. Her skin was warm. He understood then that a home wasn't a piece of land you claimed with a fence and a deed. It was the small patch of ground you chose to defend, not for yourself, but for the person standing beside you. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.